WV Uncommon Place. This podcast is a variety podcast that houses numerous series to cover mental health, empowerment, podcast framework, and various intimate series to get to know the hosts. Along with occasional movies reviews and dives in pop culture with our event podcast episodes. The Uncommon Place digs into bringing guests on that stories don't fit the mold and are very different. WV stands for the great state of West Virginia, and every quarter we cover something in West Virginia. Stacy and myself JR are your hosts, so please come along for this venture to our Uncommon Place.
Welcome to West Virginia Uncommon Place. Today's episode is one that I've been wanting to do for a while. Nintendo versus Sega. Growing up, I was born in 1985, so I want to say about 88, 89, I had the NES. We had a Sega Master System, which we played a little bit, but the Sega Master System didn't do as great as the NES did. Punch-Out, different things like that. But then, about 1991 or 92, I forgot exactly, we ended up getting the Super Nintendo for Christmas, and then we got a Sega Genesis for Christmas later, the next Christmas. And from at least 1992 up until 1997, I'm talking about we would go head to head on games. I'll never forget what set the systems apart for me. It was when the most influential title on adult gaming came out, which was Mortal Kombat. A lot of people would talk about Night Trap, but I'm talking about Mortal Kombat. When Mortal Kombat came out, the Genesis version had blood in it, and the Nintendo version did not. Super Nintendo was always treated as a family-friendly system, but Sega had some raw games, even going back as far as the way that the X-Men games were made on the Genesis. The Genesis always had a higher edge than the Nintendo. Now, the Nintendo, both systems had classics. I'm not taking away from either. Because where Sega had that Mortal Kombat, Super Nintendo can always say that it had the better Street Fighters, it had the Mega Man series, it had different things going, but going neck and neck, Sonic and Super Mario were two totally different games. They were two totally different experiences, and some households were even divided, when I was growing up, because some households were Sega Genesis households, and some were Super Nintendo. Very seldom, and I'm not going to say that we were in any good spot in life then, but very seldom did I ever see a household that both had a Sega Genesis and a Super Nintendo. Now, I know, playing through the first Sonic was ridiculous, and it just took off from there. And the one thing that I liked about the Genesis was the Genesis, though, had extra little volume buttons on the original flat base one, not the little small one that people got later on in life. And they also had the Game Gear, which was a color system. It didn't last long. Nintendo did have two things that they did straight. That was the Super Nintendo and the Game Boy. The Game Boy going head to head with the Sega system. I remember having the Game Gear, and I had to have 6 AA batteries to keep that thing going, but it had a color screen, so it was cool. And it was a portable Sonic experience. I remember I got my Game Boy in 1989. I'll never forget that. My dad bought that, and I had Tetris, and then later on he got me Super Mario Land. And there was a vast difference in the game in there. And I will just say this, I had great experiences on both systems, and both systems had certain exclusives that were made first party that set them apart, like Kirby and Sega with Echo the Dolphin, which to this day is one of my favorite games. That's the only reason I have the mini console right now, because you can't get Echo the Dolphin anywhere else. The one thing, though, that put the difference between them was after 1996, my mom bought me my first real expensive system. My Sega Saturn, I believe, was $500. And it was a 32-bit system. My mom went out here, got it from the store called Rose's. She got me the black one, and then she searched around and got me a black and blue one because I was getting a little bit more competitive in Street Fighter games, Street Fighter Alpha, Alpha 2. And I noticed when I started playing that something was different about Sega. And Sega was holding strong with that through the 32-bit time, and Nintendo wasn't even fazed by 32-bit systems, because PlayStation had come out then, got one of those, and this is, mind you, this is before Metal Gear Solid or Final Fantasy VII. And the next thing you know, in '96, the Nintendo 64 popped up. Nintendo 64 popped up, and Nintendo 64 with GoldenEye, just GoldenEye. GoldenEye set up multiplayer console gaming. And that right there is where I think there was a divide with Nintendo and everything else, because Sega struggled with the Sega Saturn. They came out with the Dreamcast that lasted a year or so, or 2 years. And then Nintendo came out with the GameCube, which, when the GameCube came out, that kind of took the dominancy away from Nintendo. And then later on, PlayStation would take over with the PlayStation 2, which by all means deserves its own podcast episode one day, because to me, the PlayStation 2 is probably the best system ever made. But getting into this Nintendo-Sega war, when Sega made that Dreamcast, I knew when I played Sonic Adventure how choppy and how, because by then I was 14, 15, I played that and I went back and played Super Mario 64, which was a game that would have been dated at least 4 years in between. Super Mario 64 was way more fluent. The movement was crisp, and even later on when I got Sonic Adventure Director's Cut on the GameCube, played on the Xbox, you could still see them frame rates, and you could still see them things that, ended up being crazy. So you move on later on in the future, you see Sonic and Mario team up for the Olympics, and I think what was the greatest thing ever is when Sonic came to Smash Brothers, because you actually got Super Mario versus Sonic, what we've always wanted our whole lives, finally tapped into one place. So I give it to Sega for bouncing back as a developer and making quite a few quality games and different stuff like that. But inside the Sega versus Nintendo war, I truly will always believe this, that Sega got a little bit ahead of themselves when they came out with the Sega CD and all this extra stuff that they were doing. If they had just stuck to what made them great in the very beginning, was that edgy, the commercials that they came out with. Heck, they were the first company. They had the little cable thing where you could, they had a Sega channel with a game that went inside your game cartridge. So, they were very innovative, but their implementation was poor. And Nintendo, even to this day, does a tried and true method of, they're about like Apple when it comes to things. We're going to produce it a certain way. If you don't like it in our ecosystem, there's other places you can go. But if you go to those other places, you may not be satisfied. So my only hard gripe with Nintendo is that the nostalgia that they do provide, you get it funneled back into you, and it started with the Wii. From the Wii to the Wii U to now, you end up buying Super Mario over 4 times, the same one that you played back in 1988. You bought it over multiple times, and that's kind of ridiculous that we do it, but we do it because we like Nintendo. And with Sega still produces their games. They have a Sega Genesis Classic game that provides all of their Sega games, with the exception of Eco the Dolphin, which I don't understand. But when it comes to that period of time in life, that was the greatest console war, and that was like what has laid the foundation for what Nintendo was able to do with the Switch for a little bit, and what PlayStation has done and Xbox is doing now, the PlayStation Xbox war. So I wanted you guys to definitely know that I'm glad that you guys listened to this episode. If you have any comments, please send them over to me. We gladly appreciate everyone that listens. And this was just like a fanfare, something real quick that I wanted to do just because I liked Sega and I liked Nintendo, and that was probably the golden years of video gaming for me and for quite a few people that are in my age group. All right, guys. Once again, this is JR. Thank you.
Please follow WV Uncommonplace on Instagram, Tumblr, Twitter, TikTok, where we have some great content, Facebook, LinkedIn. Hit up the merch store at oncommonplace.square.site. Join the email list from the website, and rate, subscribe, and give feedback from your favorite podcatcher. And lastly, thanks for listening, and tune into the next episode.